Good afternoon. I'm sure that by now most people know my name. In case anybody came in late this afternoon and might not know, my name is Joe Goldberg. I'm the founder for the Canadian Symposium for Parental Alienation Syndrome. I know that many people here today are members of the Ontario Association of Family Mediators. So it is a great honor for me to be able to introduce to you a gentleman involved in family mediation. His name is Bob Finlay. Bob is a registered marriage and family therapist, family and child protection mediator, and parenting coordinator in private practice from Vancouver, British Columbia. He's worked as a family therapist for 37 years and as a mediator for 15 years. He is on the executive of the British Columbia he is on the executive of the British Columbia Parenting Coordinators Roster Society, which was recently established in 2008. He has worked as a mediator in over 400 child protection files. Bob is trained and mentored to new child protection, has trained and mentored new child protection mediators who received their training through the Dispute Resolution Practicum Society in Vancouver. Although mediation is a professional passion, he spends a lot of his personal time on the squash court, which is why Bob is obviously very fit. He is a custody and access evaluator for the last 15 years. It's my great pleasure to introduce Bob Finlay.
Nice to be back in Toronto. My wife and I lived here in the Toronto area for years, and before moving out to Vancouver in 1990, and certainly enjoyed our time here, so it's great to be back. One of the nice things about Vancouver is in less than a year, the 2010 Olympics are coming to Vancouver, so the city's abuzz with lots of activity. Also, what we're abuzz with is probably one of the worst gang wars in Canadian history over cocaine. There's two main gangs that are fighting it out, and the newspapers are every day telling us about the various types of violence that are going on in the streets. What the newspapers don't report, however, is all of the wars that are going on within families and between families. And so I'm really here to talk about how we as mediators can act as effective peacekeepers. And I need to tell you, I think from the beginning that because of my background as a family therapist, that's really the approach and style and philosophy that I bring to my mediation work as well. So I really like to work or think of mediation as being a systems type of process involving a variety of different people, involving a variety of different family members. And that I've found has been quite effective for me. I also wanted to mention that in my presentation that I'm going to go from general concepts and principles to more specific strategies and interventions. I know a number of you here are already practicing family mediation and are looking for some practice tips, some strategies that might be helpful for you in your practice, which I'll gladly share with you today, what's worked for me and what hasn't. And so with that, I'm going to start with a rather complicated chart here. There we are. Now, these overheads I might mention, we couldn't make them available. I couldn't get them made available for all of you today. So what I'm going to do after the conference is post them on my website. So if you want to get them after the conference, you're certainly welcome to download them that way. Anyway, this community systems approach to PAS, this diagram, which, believe it or not, came to me in a dream. And some of you are going to shake your heads and say, typical therapist, right? It had to come from a dream. Yeah, I was actually thinking about a number of things to do with PAS, and one morning I woke up and there it was for me, this particular diagram. Now, this diagram really represents an ideal community-based approach, systemic approach, to intervening with PAS. And having said that, I'm also going to say at the same time that in British Columbia anyway, and I suspect in many other jurisdictions, that system does not exist. And we're trying to work towards it, but in actual fact, it doesn't exist. So the system you see in the diagram here that I'm going to go through and explain in more detail really is something to work towards. It's kind of a vision that I would have of the ideal treatment system. So as you can see at the top of the diagram, in the ideal world, there would be a base of community professionals, including lawyers, child protection social workers, mental health therapists, and counselors of lots of variety and sorts, who would be trained in identifying PAS and would be able to make referrals to a mediation resource. And the broad base of community professionals, often they would come in contact with these families with children with PAS symptoms and families who support those symptoms through high conflict separations, through child resistance to visitation, and through allegations of alienation, which are all common sorts of presenting issues that professionals come across. And there's often also allegations of child abuse as well. And where there are allegations of child abuse rising to the level of being reportable, then the Child Protection Authority would get involved and do their own investigation and evaluation. So in the ideal world, the community-based professional would have enough training and knowledge to be able to make the referral to a mediation resource. And what I'm trying to do with this diagram is also kind of illustrate where I think mediation could be used most effectively. And if they were able to refer to a mediation resource that I might add would be affordable, and in British Columbia we have some mediators who are government funded, but a lot of mediators are private, and so a lot of families can't make use of mediation or don't think to use mediation. It's too expensive for them. So this mediation resource would be able to intervene quite quickly with the family, because as you've heard other speakers say, and certainly in my experience, unless you intervene quickly with these families, there's greater risk that there's going to be long-term damage to the parent-child relationship and to the child themselves. So the mediator could move in fairly quickly and help the family begin to organize a plan, whether it's to choose an evaluator. The next step in my diagram would be assessment. So if PAS is suspected, that there would be a referral, and the mediator would help the family to choose an evaluator, choose an assessment resource, and in the ideal world, the assessment resource, once again, would be affordable. Now, in British Columbia, when people hire private evaluators, they're paying anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 to get that evaluation done. And for many people, that's out of their reach. The government-funded assessors, I believe, are not fully qualified to do these kinds of assessments, and they tend to do assessments that are fairly narrow in scope and really don't come up with very useful treatment recommendations. So that's definitely a problem. So in the ideal world, that would be a resource available that would be affordable. And then moving from assessment, if an assessment was done, and sometimes I might say the Child Protection Authority does their own assessment and determines whether they think PAS is an issue. And also the Child Protection Authority can refer to a mediator or a mediation resource to do the mediation around their finding of PAS. So if they have found that PAS is in fact the child abuse that is taking place, that it's referred to mediation for ongoing follow-up and implementation. And I will say on a positive note that in British Columbia we have a well-developed child protection mediation program across the whole province, and it's well supported by government funding. So that's part of the good news happening in BC. All right, so the assessment gets done, and the assessor then decides or determines whether the child is displaying PAS symptoms or perhaps maybe displaying symptoms of other kinds of disruptions in the parent-child relationship. And if you're familiar with Joan Kelly and Janet Johnson's work, they wrote an article in 2001 called The Reformulation of Parental Alienation Syndrome, in which they argued that the place to start your assessment is to start by looking at the child and how the child presents. Look at the effects on the child first, and then take it from there. So they actually put the parent-child relationship on a continuum. So on the one end of the continuum are healthy relationships between both parents and the child post-separation. And then the next level of on the continuum would be child alliance, where the child is saying, I mainly want to spend most of my time with one parent. I want to spend some time with the other parent, but the child has mixed feelings about spending time with that other parent. So the child shows some ambivalence about the relationship with the more absent parent. The next stage on the continuum is child estrangement. So Kelly and Johnson refer to that as realistic estrangement. They're saying basically that that children in this situation have usually suffered some kind of abuse by one of the parents. And so their reluctance or resistance to have access or to have contact with that parent is realistic. It's based on actual circumstances and actual fear that they may have of that parent. And so different interventions are needed with that type of situation, as opposed to a situation on the far end of the continuum where the child really presents with a number of PAS symptoms, and we can, and the evaluator can give that diagnosis that it is a PAS case. All right, so looking at the bottom part of the chart, so you can see that depending on where the child lines up on that continuum, there might be different interventions that the community could put together. And I want to emphasize that what's really needed with PAS cases here is a coordinated team approach. You need to bring a variety of services together and working together in a coordinated fashion like a team. Otherwise, these kinds of plans, even court-ordered types of plans, tend to fall apart. So you can see on the right-hand bottom right-hand corner of the chart that in child estrangement cases, in particular in PAS cases, there would be court involvement in the ideal world. There'd be detailed orders, there'd be sanctions in the orders for compliance, and there'd be regular reports to the court, so the court is kept aware of the progress of the case. Now in BC, with the Child Protection Authority and child protection mediation, those kinds of circumstances do tend to occur. Judges are now, with child protection cases where PS is a factor, are beginning to impose sanctions and are becoming aware that PAS is a form of child abuse. So that's good news. But in other streams within the family justice system, it's not happening nearly as much. The box at the bottom there where it says PC really refers to a parenting coordinator. I'm not sure if you have parenting coordinators in Ontario. We've just started to have them in BC. And parenting coordinators can act as arbitrators as well as mediators. So they take on a mediation function, but they also can arbitrate disputes if the parents cannot reach agreement. And having a PC involved with a PAS case and a PAS family is certainly, I think, an effective approach to take. And then you can see the list of various services on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side that could be brought to bear on this particular file and in a coordinated fashion. And mediators can actually act as coordinators of that team. They can actually, because they're seen as neutral third-party facilitators, they can take on these services and bring professionals together in a coordinated way and keep track of the progress of the file. Okay, so enough about that diagram. All right, so moving on to mediation goals. So when it comes to a PAS file, I think there's three main goals that we want to focus on as mediators. First one is we want to get a plan together to reestablish contact quickly. We know that the longer that there is a disruption in access, the more damaged the parent-child relationship can become, the more the child is at risk for long-term emotional disturbance. Second main goal would be implementing court-ordered remedies. So if the court has laid out an order with some detailed terms, in the ideal world there would be detailed terms and sanctions, then the mediator can move in and assist the parties to implement that plan and work out the details of that planning. Now in BC we're starting to make some progress, but overall I would say it's very sporadic. Some courts, some judges accept PAS as a real phenomena, others don't. I'm sure you're having a similar experience here in Ontario and other parts of Canada. So it is definitely somewhat frustrating. Some of these files really bog down in the court system because the courts don't take a firm enough view with these issues. Third goal, transforming relationships. Some mediators philosophically would think that's being too optimistic, maybe going too far in terms of our role as a mediator. I happen to disagree. I think that we can hold out that goal. We don't always achieve it. But I think in helping the family to heal their relationships, to shift the way they deal with each other, is a worthy goal, and not always accomplished in every situation, but if it can be accomplished, it allows for more long-term prevention, because if you only get an agreement and you don't get a shift in the relationships, the agreements soon break down. That's been my experience. So you need a shift in the relationships. Okay, various mediator roles. In my experience, we need to take on more than just being a neutral facilitator. We need to take on a variety of roles with these cases in order to be effective. As mediators, we're trained primarily to be facilitators, to organize and design a process, run the process, help the parties negotiate and reach agreement. That, of course, is still important, but these other roles also become equally important with a PAS family. And those other roles are an educator, referral broker, case manager, and a parenting coordinator, and I'll talk about each of those a little bit more. So in terms of the mediator as educator, it's important that the parents and extended family, and sometimes lawyers and mental health professionals, be made aware of the literature on child adjustment. There's some pretty good literature base now on what makes for positive, healthy child adjustment post-separation. Some of those findings are, for example, that when a child is exposed to traumatic, violent incidents between parents, that has tremendous effect on their development and well-being. Or if they're exposed to long-term chronic conflict, this has a really negative effect on their well-being. And another factor would be if they are denied a parent relationship, this definitely has a long-term effect on their well-being. And so making parents aware of that and educating them about that is important, as well as the professionals involved with them. Secondly, you can educate family members about taking a family systems approach to the problem. That is recognizing that everybody is playing a part in maintaining the problem. And that's an assumption I make as a family therapist, is that although the alienating parent may be the one that starts the process, that parent would not be allowed to continue to behave that way unless there were family members supporting that process, and the legal system supporting that process, and professionals supporting that process. So everybody plays a part, and I look at it systemically, and sometimes it's important to bring that to the attention of the parties. Also, educating them about the symptoms of PAS and the effects of PAS on child development are important pieces of information that parents need. Although it is not an official disorder, PAS is not recognized as an official disorder, I treat it as if it is when I'm talking to parents. I treat it as if it is a disorder of childhood, and is something that, unless they work together to alleviate, that this child is going to develop a lot of other difficulties as they grow and mature and develop. And when I take that approach, it's surprising how many parents begin to see it as something they need to band together to work on together as a team. I sometimes use the analogy with parents, what if your child was diabetic? Would you just stand back and let them decide not to take their insulin, or not to take their medication, or not to get treatment? And they say, of course not. I said, okay, well, if you think of PAS as a disorder, a legitimate disorder, would you stand back and not allow the child to take their medicine? And their medicine may consist of making sure they have contact with the absent parent. It might include child counseling or child therapy. It might include other kinds of interventions that are going to help to reestablish that relationship. I also educate parents about strategies to encourage visitation when the child is resistant, and how to deal with that. And I also give out lists of books and articles that they can read on their own to educate themselves about the problem. Whoops. Oh, there we go. Okay, great. Okay, so the mediator as a referral broker. So Mediators can play a very useful function in terms of advising the party what community resources are available in the community that might assist them. Also knowing about particular professionals in the community that might be familiar with PAS and can work with that family. Very important to be able to provide that knowledge, because parents and family members come in for a mediation process and they really don't know what's in the community and what's going to help them. And so I think a mediator can provide a lot of useful information that way, and can also help the parties clarify, okay, what community resources are needed and what are your criteria going to be for selecting them. You know, let's look at availability and cost, background, qualifications. Let's look at all of that and negotiate a plan around even selecting community resources that might be needed. And a mediator can also provide a recommended list of referrals if needed. And a mediator can also approach professionals that the parties agree they want to perhaps explore whether they want that professional to work with them or not. So the mediator is seen as once again, a neutral third party. Sometimes the parties don't trust each other to do the selecting, and so they ask the mediator to approach various professionals that they are engaged in looking at as possible resources to see whether they're available and what the costs are, and whether they can work with the family. Okay, the mediator is case manager. Once again, I'm advocating for a coordinated team approach to PAS files. And the mediator can take on the role of a case manager. That is, organizing meetings between professionals and family members, chairing those meetings, writing and distributing agreements that come out of those meetings, checking on follow-through. Very important with these files that there's somebody checking on follow-through. Okay, so we had an agreement that you were going to do this and this person was going to do that. Did it actually happen? And then communicating with parents and professionals, sharing information between the parties, providing summary reports to the court, not reports that contain recommendations, but just reports on what the parties have decided on, how the planning is going, and a summary of the mediation process to that point in time. One of the disadvantages of a case manager role is that it's very time-consuming and can be very costly. So. Okay, and then the role of the parenting coordinator. This is where a person is appointed by the court and with the consent of the parties to act with the authority of the court to make decisions that the parents are unable to reach agreement about. Normally, as a parenting coordinator, I have the parents sign a contract with me that outlines clearly what the scope of my authority is, what the terms of my involvement are going to be. However, I had a recent case where the parents signed the contract. We didn't get a court order. The parents agreed to sign the contract. The lawyers agreed that they would appoint me as the PC. And we had to make, or I had to make a decision, I should say, an arbitrated decision around the child's involvement with hockey. And so I made a decision about it and wrote it out as a ruling, sent it to both parents, talked to both parents before I gave out my ruling. And the mother didn't like my ruling, and so she completely withdrew from the process. Said, I'm just not going to participate anymore, and I'm not going to talk to the PC anymore, and deal with it. And so the father was left to just have to appeal it, and had to go back to court to appeal my ruling. So what I learned from that file is that you get a court order on top of your contract. And that doesn't guarantee compliance, but it certainly helps with compliance. And PCs in BC are governed under the Commercial Arbitration Act, which outlines the powers of an arbitrator. So if the process breaks down, the only recourse under that piece of legislation is that the parent who is left holding the bag, so to speak, has to go back to court to make the appeal. Okay, mediator training and qualifications. The key words here for me are, as you would hear on TV, I think it's to do with lotteries. Know your limit, play within it. And I think that's true for us as mediators, that we have to know what our strengths and weaknesses are. These are tough families to deal with, and they can easily overwhelm you. And so you really need to know what you're comfortable working with and what you're not. I've got a list there of possible sources of information and sources of knowledge that could be of use to mediators in working with these files. and I'll just read them quickly. So the divorce literature and child adjustment is very important, and as I said earlier, there's a fair amount of it starting to come out. The literature on PAS is certainly relevant and needed, and some family systems training. You don't have to be a family therapist, but just to have some idea of how families work and what some of the dynamics are is helpful. I think information on child development, knowing that this is how children at different stages of development respond to alienating behavior, and also sometimes children show various signs of PAS when it's actually not PAS, and it's more of a developmental difficulty. So being able to kind of sort that out is important for a mediator to know about. Some mental health training sometimes helps. You've heard some previous speakers talk about the psychopathology of alienating parents who are in severe cases. And so having at least some awareness of mental health issues and some awareness of how some of these folks present can be very useful. I think what's also useful is agreement writing. When you're writing up a mediation agreement on a PAS file, there are some terms and language that are very useful to put in there. And I think if you know some of those, that can be helpful as well. Knowing the applicable legislation in your jurisdiction is a necessity, I think. In British Columbia, we have 3 pieces of legislation that are applicable for these files. One is the Child and Family and Community Service Act, which covers all child protection matters. The other is the Family Relations Act, which covers custody and access and division of assets, and then the Commercial Arbitration Act. So familiarity with all of those pieces of legislation is, I think, quite necessary. All right, so knowing your limits and playing within it means that sometimes you need to know what your deficits and weaknesses are, but that means you can compensate. Sometimes you can co-mediate with someone who has a strength in an area that you don't have. Or sometimes you can bring experts into a mediation that can speak to various issues that you're not in a position to speak about. And also having supervision and consultation in dealing with these files, I think, is essential. As I said, they're very complex, very tough files. Okay, mediator traps. As mediators, we're prone to making assumptions about, in this case, PAS files, just like anybody else is prone to making assumptions. Some of the assumptions that I think can act as traps for mediators are some of the following. First of all, that the alienating parent is solely responsible for the alienation. In my experience, that isn't always true. What tends to be more true in my experience is that they may start the process, but they're not always the ones that are solely responsible for maintaining it. Usually once the process gets started, the rejected parent starts to react in various ways, the child starts to react in various ways, the extended family jump in, professionals jump in, lawyers jump in. You've got a real melting pot of various kinds of interaction going on. And what I find is that you have to look at it systemically, that everyone is playing a part in making that happen. Most children in high conflict families become alienated. The research doesn't support that. Research says basically 20% of children become alienated in high conflict families. So they're more at risk, but one doesn't always necessarily lead to the other. Another assumption often that's made is that one child is alienated, the siblings are going to become alienated as well. That also doesn't seem to be borne out by the research or by experience. I've dealt with a number of families where one child tends to be the target of the alienation. The siblings often develop ambivalent relationships with the rejected parent, but don't necessarily become fully alienated. And sometimes children as well can be very resilient. Some kids have a very strong sense of self, and they're able to sort through some of the negative message they're getting from the alienating parent and sort it out for themselves and make sense of it for themselves and still maintain a positive attitude towards the rejected parent. Sometimes certain children have such a strong bond with the rejected parent pre-separation that really carries over. And despite the alienating parent's attempts to disrupt that relationship, because the child has such good memories and such positive feelings towards the rejected parent from the pre-separation times, that it carries over and the child develops some resilience or some resistance to being inoculated. PS is just a legal strategy. Well, sometimes it's used that way. I don't think there's any question that sometimes counsel will use that as a legal strategy. But I think we need to realize that it's a real disorder. It's not something that we can minimize. A mediation agreement will fix the problem. Not usually. That might be a step in the right direction. But mediation agreements are prone to falling apart very quickly unless the proper supports are in place and the proper monitoring and enforcement are in place. Getting in over your head. So mediators are prone, I think, to once again being overwhelmed by these families unless they watch some of these traps. So before you throw people in the same room together to negotiate, make sure you've got a very clear agenda, very clear goals. If it's unclear or fuzzy, they're going to jump all over you, and it's going to go sideways very, very quickly. Underestimating the power of the family system. These family systems, I would almost use the metaphor like severe weather systems. They suck you in and they throw you around. And you as a mediator, even though you are supposed to be this neutral person and may act professionally and as a neutral party, at some point in the process, you're going to get criticized and attacked by people in the family. It's inevitable. They're going to find something that they're not going to like about you or something they thought you should have done. And so you need to be prepared for that and how to deal with that. Inadequate preparation of participants. I rarely put people into a room together to negotiate unless I'm confident that they are prepared to negotiate and they're in a place where they have some clear goals and a clear plan that they want to negotiate together. And if they're not properly prepared, then I may decide not to go ahead with the mediation. Or if I don't think they can be properly prepared, then I may not go ahead with mediation. Mediation may not be the intervention that they need. Right? Going solo. I think with milder forms of alienation, I mean, in most high conflict families, there's some kind of alienating behavior going on. But whether it rises to the degree of being severe, whether it results in the child having PAS is another matter. There are a lot of factors that go into deciding that. So whether you decide to go solo or not depends on your comfort level, your level of skill, how confident you are in doing that particular mediation, but also the degree of severity. I think if the PAS is quite severe and the family is quite entrenched, going solo, which means either mediating by yourself without a co-mediator or going into a mediation without other parties around the table that can support a positive change process, I think you're going to get killed. So that's been my experience. Mediating too much too quickly. Once again, with more severe cases, if they are appropriate candidates for mediation, you need to take it in bite-sized pieces. You need to break the process down into pieces that they can negotiate. You want to build a track record of success, and you want to build confidence in the mediation. If you try doing too much too quickly, then the process tends to fall apart. Aligning with one family member. I would say that's probably a no-no in any mediation situation. And most mediators are trained to avoid that. However, in these families, because they're very highly emotional and they're very sensitive, they may misinterpret your behavior as aligning with them. For example, if I'm doing a pre-mediation meeting with a parent and I'm listening intently and with interest and I'm using all my micro skills like paraphrasing and open-ended questions and showing interest, if I don't make it clear to them that there's a difference between me showing interest and trying to understand their point of view and taking their side, then I need to make that explicit to them. And that's often what I do. I will say to parents ahead of time, you know, for the next hour we spend together, I'm going to listen to you as carefully as I can. I'm going to try to really understand you. Don't take that to mean that I am now taking your side, okay? Because my job is to look at the big picture. Proceeding without adequate court-prescribed remedies. As I said, the courts are inconsistent. Sometimes as a mediator, I reject certain cases because I know if I go into a mediation situation without the adequate court supports, it's going to end up in failure. right? I can almost predict that ahead of time. So sometimes I'll just say, unless we can get the court to prescribe a particular plan that can be supported, I'm not going to jump into the fray. We'll have to look at what the other options are. Inadequate training, knowledge, consultation, we talked about that before. Inadequate professional boundaries, availability, fees, role. When I sit down to do a pre-mediation with people, I make it really clear what my boundaries are, what the fees are, who's going to pay what, when, my availability, and my role. And all of that needs to be really clear. With these families, if it's not clear, if you leave stuff kind of fuzzy, they can pick up on that and use it against you and use it to break down the process. So you have to be really clear with people. Also, you have to get people to sign a participation agreement to participate. And in that agreement, it needs to clearly outline, once again, what my role is, what the ground rules are of the mediation. It needs to outline issues around confidentiality and communication between the parties. All of that needs to be clearly laid out before you start that group meeting. And last but not least, thin skin. If you have the type of personality where you need approval or need to please people, you're going to get eaten for breakfast, lunch, and dinner by these families. You need to have a thick skin. At some point, as I say, they're going to probably criticize or attack you in some way. Okay, mediation assessment. I think it's important that mediators be able to answer these questions in preparing for a mediation. Once again, I try not to go into a group mediation where all the parties are together until I know the family fairly well and I have some good sources of information at my disposal. So some of these questions are, what are the parties' underlying goals and interests? What are the dynamics in this family that support PAS? And those first two questions might get answered through a custody and access evaluation, and you might not have to spend much time learning about that. How ready are the parties to negotiate and follow a plan? One thing sometimes we don't take into account is people's readiness to negotiate and people's awareness about what needs to be negotiated. Sometimes you have to do a lot of preparation to get people to the point where they're seeing some value in negotiating a plan. How can I encourage change? Who should be included in the mediation? What are the most important issues? What type of process will support the negotiation? And how can I best manage the emotional climate? The emotional climate issue is really important. These families tend to be highly emotional. And if you lose control of that, then you lose control of the mediation and the negotiation process. There we go. This diagram didn't come to me in a dream, although it looks like it. But this diagram represents the different sources of information that a mediator can tap into in being able to design a process. So it covers everything from interviewing the child, and there's some questions as to whether a mediator should interview a child. In my experience, I always interview the children, not for the purposes of a psychological assessment or anything like that, but just to find out who this child is that the parents are talking about, just to get my own experience with the child. And even if custody and access evaluation has been done, it's often useful for the mediator to get to know the child a little bit and what kinds of issues are on their mind and how they're presenting. Also interviewing the parents clearly and doing pre-mediation orientations with them. Excuse me. When I do pre-mediation orientations with parents, I will, if possible, include the lawyers in that. I want them to begin to think collaboratively and begin to think in terms of their clients' interests and begin to think in terms of negotiation strategies with the other parties. Then there are a variety of other sources of information as well that are important. For example, third parties, who in the extended family, for example, would be important to include in the mediation? What professionals that are working with the family might be important to include in the mediation? Should you have the custody and access evaluator attend the mediation and give a report on their evaluation and allow for some dialogue or discussion about their findings? So those are all interesting questions that go into the design of the mediation itself. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I think most of you are probably familiar with Richard Gardner's criteria, but he has 8 criteria for his diagnosis, or where he would come up with a diagnosis of PAS. And I think in terms of Gardner's criteria, they still hold up pretty well today as far as I'm concerned. But as in the next slide, I'll show you a little bit about Joan Kelly and Janet Johnson's approach to it, where they thought Richard Gardner's criteria were a bit too narrow. I think it's important, once again, as mediators, that we just have this information and be able to get a sense of what PAS is and how it presents itself. Okay, so Kelly and Johnson's criteria, so they made the argument that Gardner's criteria were a bit too narrow. They didn't think that there was enough of a systems flavor to it. They see PAS as the result of multiple factors rather than just the actions of an alienating parent. We also talked about the continuum of parent-child relationships. They also pointed out that measures of child alienation are lacking and tend to be inconsistent. So we're not always on the same page in terms of being able to identify it. However, having said that, Janet Johnson has developed a comprehensive assessment instrument where people are asked questions about the parent's individual histories, the alienating parent, rejecting parent, and child behaviors, extended family behaviors, and professionals' behaviors. And she puts that all together into a multiple factor kind of scenario, which paints a picture of how the PAS may have actually come to pass and been created. I'm currently in the process of developing a pre-mediation questionnaire based on Janet Johnson's assessment instruments, sort of a modified form, not for the purpose of doing, once again, a psychological assessment, but for the purpose of raising awareness in the family that there are multiple factors that they need to consider, and also giving me that information as well, which can be very useful in the design of the mediation. Just going to talk a little bit about systemic thinking. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know we're running out of time here. But basically, that everyone plays a part. Sometimes the PAS distracts from other issues. As a family therapist, when a child presents with symptoms, we tend to look at other parts of the family system as well and say, okay, what's going on in the rest of the family that might be helping to create or maintain this problem? I'll give you an example from my practice. Had this young man come in with his wife it was actually for marital therapy. And as I gathered more information about his history, he said that he had been a product of parental alienation in his childhood, that his mother had spent a lot of time, in his words, poisoning his mind against his father after the separation. And so I asked more about her background and took it back 1 or 2 generations. And he said actually he'd found out that his mother had been sexually abused by her father, and that his mother developed this hatred for men. And that was obviously a big factor in the marital breakup, but also in the alienation process as well. So this particular man, who is now an adult male and experienced PAS as a child, you can see that the roots go way back, and the roots are pretty deep. And so when you're looking at PAS, once again, from a systemic point of view, you're looking at what are the different layers to this problem, right? Rather than just getting focused just on the symptoms themselves. The triangle there really talks about how in families, when a relationship is unstable, and this in PAS files, it's an unstable relationship between the parents, often the child comes in to stabilize that relationship. Now, the child doesn't do that consciously. The child tends to do that unconsciously. So you've got an alienating parent who acts as a persecutor and blames and attacks, and then you've got the rejected parent on the receiving end who feels like the victim, and then you've got the child in the middle who is responding and trying to deal with these loyalty conflicts and the conflict going on between the parents. Okay? And sometimes PAS is a result of that. Sometimes the child tries to resolve that conflict by aligning with one parent and accepting the negative messages from that parent, because for them it's easier that way than trying to carry this ambivalence that they have about both parents and trying to sort out all the confusion. Okay? Also, if you're going to think systemically, think circles, not cause and effect. Okay? Think of the cat chasing its tail. That's what happens in families. You get the circular interaction that goes on of blaming, counterattack, attack, counterattack, back and forth in a circle. And so those kinds of interactional circles are what lawyers and therapists and other professionals get drawn into as the family tries to sort it out. Another tool that family therapists use, and actually I use in mediation, is called a genogram. This is mapping out a family system. Why would a mediator want to map out a family system? Well, because there are resources within that family system that can help to solve the problem. And often you don't even find out about those resources until you start to ask about them and start to map them out. So a genogram is composed of different symbols. The square symbols represent males, the round symbols represent females, and I'm not going to comment any further on that one, but that's just how the genogram was developed. This is a genogram of an actual family that I did a custody and access evaluation on. And as you can see in the diagram, the father allegedly had an affair. He denied that the involvement with the girlfriend took place prior to marriage. He said it was after the separation. And the mother and father got involved in some interesting dynamics. Certainly I found some significant evidence that the mother was engaging in alienating behavior, even though she denied it. She did some pretty bizarre things, like she sent flowers to the father's workplace. And by the way, the father met the girlfriend at the workplace, so they were working there together. She sent flowers with a big sign on it saying, "I hope the two of you have a happy life together," and made sure the receptionist and everybody else could see the words. So she was obviously trying to humiliate and embarrass him. She also worked for a telephone company, and so she used her employee access to get access to the telephone records of the father and of the girlfriend, and she ended up being disciplined for that. So, and she also had an extremely close attachment with both children. There's a 14-year-old boy and a 9-year-old girl. And she was the primary homemaker and primary caregiver for the children, so she had a very close attachment with them. And the children could see the distress that she was in as a result of the breakup of the marriage. She got quite depressed and would cry every day, and that kind of thing, and would be very angry with the father in front of the children. And so they were exposed to that. Now, the 14-year-old boy ended up kind of being a protector of the family. He kind of took on a traditional male role. And would protect the mother against the father. So he became the alienated child. His sister, interestingly enough, did not become fully alienated. She, although she developed some resistance to visitation with the father. And I think that was primarily because of the influence of the brother. And that's sometimes one thing we don't fully look at, is the influence of the siblings on alienation. Sometimes an alienated child has great influence on their siblings, depending on the relationship, and can really contribute to the alienation. Now, the father played a part in this file as well. And he wasn't just an innocent party. So one of his ways of dealing with the mother's behavior and her disruption in access was he became basically a bully. He began to bully the children into complying with visits. He would show up at the mother's house, the matrimonial home, demand to see the children. If the children would be frightened, they wouldn't want to come out of the house. And then on another occasion, he invited the girlfriend along for an access visit. The children thought they were only going to be seeing the father. All of a sudden, the girlfriend's in the car. They drive off together. The kids start to cry, and the father won't take them home. All right, so one thing you have to realize in these families as well is that there aren't really any innocent parties. I mean, I know in some severe cases there are, but in the vast majority of cases, in my experience, there aren't any real innocent parties. The rejected parent plays a part often in keeping the alienation going. Okay? So because of the way the father in this situation handled the anger and his bullying behavior, he really confirmed for the children and for the mother that, yeah, he's a bad dude, right? You can't really trust him. You can't really go with him. Okay? So just something to keep in mind. Another thing around culture, alienation looks different in other cultures than it does in white North American middle-class families. I've worked with East Indian families, for example, where the mother traditionally lives with the father's family. And if the father's family feels that she has done something wrong, broken cultural norms, made some kind of mistake that shames the family, she gets alienated, and she gets alienated from the child as well. So there's very different dynamics that go on. And I often notice in Asian families as well, where shame it can be a big dynamic, that alienation looks different in those cultures as well. Context influences behavior. Why do mediators need to know that? Well, when you're doing transitions, transition planning, and transitions mean that you're having a plan for the child to be transitioning from one home to the other home, to have access, let's say, with the father. The child's resistance to doing that may shift or change depending on the context they're in. So if you set up the transition in the home of the mother, the child is, I can almost predict 100%, the child's going to be resistant in leaving that mother, all right? But if you set it up so that there's a neutral relative who has a more neutral position in the family to come and pick up the child, take the child to a neutral location where the father can then meet the child and you can do a smoother transition, things tend to go a lot smoother, all right? So as a mediator, it's important to know if you change the context and advise the parties about the change in context, that really helps. Homeostasis and resistance to change. As human beings, we don't tend to change unless we're in pain. Same for families. They don't like to change unless somebody's got a gun to their head, okay? So expect resistance to change, all right? It's going to happen. How am I doing for time? Got 10 minutes? Okay. I'm just going to skip by that. And I'll quickly go through third parties. One thing I forgot to mention. I'm actually just going to go back here. No, just a second. There. Now, the reason I forgot to tell you, the reason I mentioned, or I filled in the one square as a green color, that represents the maternal grandfather. And what was interesting in this family, when we did the genogram, was we discovered that the maternal grandfather, as I talked to the parents about it, and I actually met him as well, that he had a pretty positive, neutral attitude towards the father. Okay? And he had an excellent relationship with the mother, and he had an excellent relationship with the kids. Okay? So I give him the green light. He's a resource in that family. I want to have him in the mediation. Okay? But I wouldn't have known that unless I did this kind of assessment. So that speaks to third parties, and I think previous speakers have also spoken to the fact that you don't necessarily assume that lawyers, counselors, and other experts know how to participate in the mediation, or know how to make it productive, or know how to be collaborative. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have to do as much preparation with them as you do with family members. Okay, I want to get to sort of the end part a bit more, but in terms of child interviews, I may do a more extensive child interview if there hasn't been a custody and access evaluation. And anyway, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to skip through some stuff here. Well, one thing I do want to mention is, let's see here, there we go. With the alienating parent, in terms of a mediation process, in my experience, unless you get the alienating parent involved in the process of correcting the situation, even if you get a mediated agreement of some kind, it's going to break down. That person's probably going to sabotage the implementation of it. You have to engage the alienating parent. You have to find some way of helping them to see that there's some benefit in it. Now, if they don't get it, if they don't have the insight to know that, and there are obviously lots of examples of that, then even if there's a court-ordered involvement in mediation, at least get them into the room, get them into a situation where they have to start to work with you. Then you've got a chance to have an impact. But it's very important to have the alienating parent involved in the mediation. Okay, so this is kind of my top 10 list of pre-mediation interventions. Let's see here. Okay, so first of all, I think when I'm sitting with parents or with extended family members, I see the complaints that they present with, and there's lots of them in these families, as embedded wishes. In other words, within each complaint, there's a wish. And a wish can be transformed into a goal, right? So if I can listen for what the wish is and help them to recognize that their complaint is an embedded wish, maybe I can help them to start to develop some goals. Case example. So I had this father who complained continually about the mother's alienating behavior. There was an evaluation done on the family. The evaluator didn't find a lot of evidence that the mother was alienating the child to any large degree. Some mild stuff was going on. But the father was convinced that the mother was participating in a lot of alienating behavior. So as we went through all of his complaints, what I noticed was that there was a theme in what he was saying, which was basically he was feeling in a one-down position. He was really feeling powerless, and he was really feeling inadequate as a father. And that these feelings had predated the separation. He actually had those feelings when he was married to this woman, all right? And it just carried on and got worse in the post-separation situation. So as I began to help him to identify that and to talk about, okay, well, what do you need to do in this process, in this mediation process, to help yourself to feel like you're on equal ground with the mother, okay? So we started to focus on that. Listening using micro skills but not aligning, we talked about that. Poking holes in negative beliefs. That was a phrase that came from Amy Baker. I believe she's talking this evening. Even with an entrenched family system, there are opportunities where you can poke holes in their belief system and actually start to get them to consider some change. We talked about the importance of educating. We talked about reviewing strategies to deal with child resistance. Important to talk about mediation as a new beginning. People will come in and say, oh, nothing's going to change. You know, she's going to do this or he's going to do that. Well, they might repeat their old patterns of behavior. But if you talk about mediation as an opportunity to have a new beginning, a fresh start, we're going to do some new planning here, and we're going to come up with some steps to address your concerns. Encouraging empowerment. What are you going to do if the other parent does not change? What's your plan going to be? Diffusing negative emotions. Tends to be a lot of them with these families. And what happens in mediation, and I talk about the frontal cortex lobotomy, which really refers to the fact that if we are highly charged emotionally, our frontal cortex goes dead. We're unable to think clearly. We're unable to function in any kind of objective fashion. We're unable to get any perspective on the situation. So I really help parents and people in the mediation to get a handle on their own emotions and to have a plan before they go into the mediation about how to deal with those emotions. Case example, a mother who knew she was going to get triggered by the presence of the father in the room, and that she was going to get very anxious and maybe very angry. What we decided together was that she would bring a picture of her daughter with her into the mediation, and every time she could feel herself getting triggered, she'd look at the picture of the daughter. Okay? And when she did that, she would think about how beautiful this child is, how wonderful it is that she's the mother of this child, and even though she hated the father, that this was something good that came out of their relationship. And she would have those thoughts, and that helped her to calm right down. Okay? So she had her own plan. Compliments are very important. If you see the child for an interview, tell the parents all the positives you noticed about the child, right? About what a good job they've done with this child, right? Or if they do well in mediation, they get through the meeting and they conduct themselves well, give them lots of compliments, right? People love compliments. It really is encouraging for them. Developing a list of target behaviors for the AP and the RP. Helping them to identify what each of them needs to take responsibility for and change. And sometimes you can write those behaviors actually into actual agreements, right? So the mother agrees to stop doing such and such. She agrees to start doing this instead. The father agrees to stop doing such and such. He agrees to start doing other things instead. And you write that right into the agreement, okay? So it's clear for everybody. Okay, so I'm going to skip by through other things and get to the last one. Don't want to keep you guys here any longer. We have to. We're already late. Okay, managing the mediation meeting itself. I just want to say a few things about that. One thing I find useful in managing the actual mediation meeting itself is have food available. Okay? People love to eat. It's hard to yell at someone when your mouth is full, and it calms people down. Excuse me. It gives people actually the message that, yeah, we're here to negotiate, and there's some things we don't like about each other, but at the same time, we're breaking bread together. You know? It gives that kind of symbolic value. So have food there. Secondly, caucus with the parties before you start the mediation. Why would I do that? Well, would you go out and have intense exercise without warming up? No, you wouldn't. If you were smart, unless you want to pull a muscle or something, if you're smart, you would warm up. You've got to do the same with mediation. You have to get people warmed up, ready for the process. So I meet with each of the parties for a few minutes ahead of time before the mediation starts. I will include lawyers as well in that. I'll review the agenda with them and the structure of the mediation. I'll help them to focus on what's your goal for this meeting? What do you want to get out of this meeting? Okay? I want you to be aware of what it is that you want to get out of this meeting and how are you going to do that? And then their plan to manage their emotions within the meeting itself. Okay? Very useful thing to do before the meeting starts. Once the meeting starts, after I outline the agenda, I start with an opening statement. And with an opening statement as a mediator, I want to start off on a positive note. So I want to start with things like, we're here to make a plan for this child to work together, to figure out some solutions. We're figuring out how we're going to move forward on this and how we're going to do what's best for this child. All right? Now, what I would not suggest you do, looking at the opposite end of the continuum, is that you review with the parties all the court applications they've had up until that point, all the failed orders and court decisions, the amount of money it's cost them. Don't mention any of that, please. I've seen it happen. It doesn't work very well. So if you say, well, we're here because the mothers had 25 applications for sole custody and restraining orders, and the father's here because he's had 26 applications for contempt of court, not a good way to start the mediation. Begin the mediation with a focus on the child. Why would I do that? Why would I want to start by sharing information about the child? Because I want to open people's hearts up. And why do I want to open people's hearts up? Because unless you soften people and get them to think with their heart rather than just with their head, they're not going to negotiate very well. They need to get in touch with how they feel about that child and what that child needs. And then through that process, we also identify the child's needs. Honoring the parent's role. The way I do that is I have the parents present their plan first. Okay? I have them start by doing the talking. They're the ones that are raising this child. They're the ones taking responsibility for the child. What's their plan? And they need to speak first. Then I might go on to review expert reports, any court orders that maybe are in place that people need to be aware of. Sometimes it's useful to have the experts attend the mediation and speak to the work that they're doing with the family, including therapists. Then we identify issues for planning, and hopefully we get an agreement. One thing I found that does not work very well if you leave the end of the mediation and you haven't drafted an agreement. Once people leave that room, chances are they're going to change their mind, or they're going to think back and think they heard certain things but not other things. So draft the agreement on site at the end of the mediation. Have people wait while you draft the agreement. Give a draft copy to them. Go over the whole thing. Look at language. Have them get their legal advice at the same time if the lawyers are present. And if lawyers are present, they can even begin to draft terms of a consent order. So the process tends to go much smoothly and finish in a better place. Okay, there's a bunch of other stuff I wanted to cover, but I'm out of time, and you want to go to supper, I'm sure, or a happy hour, whichever comes first. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Bob, for an outstanding presentation. Please, let's give another round of applause. Mr. Bob Finley. Thank you so much. I'd like to leave our closing remarks to Dr. Richard Sauber. Thank you.
Three brief comments. The first is via Mr. Goldberg, if you would bring your badges tomorrow and wear them. That's the easiest part. The most exciting part, to remind you again about Dr. Amy Baker, who's presenting tonight, and to keep in mind that you can always go to a restaurant in Toronto, but you can't have an opportunity of hearing Dr. Baker, speaking with her individually, and hearing about her newest book. The newest one is titled, I Don't Want to Choose, How Middle School Kids Can Avoid Choosing One Parent Over the Other. And that was just reviewed. I just got the review for the American Journal of Family Therapy, got very favorable reviews about how useful it is both in clinical practice as well as in forensics. So she'll have a chance to speak with you tonight. Is Dr. Baker here? So you might want to wave in the back. I look forward to hearing Dr. Baker tonight. And the third, several people have asked me about the article by William Burnett. He's a psychiatrist at Vanderbilt University, and he wrote the article whose title I'll read you, Parental Alienation Disorder and the DSM-4. This particular article, the lead article in the American Journal of Family Therapy, is a summary essentially of what he submitted to the committee for the DSM-5. So you'll have some idea of how the syndrome then becomes a disorder and what are the critical features. There are a number of issues circulating amongst the participants here, or you can get a copy of the American Journal of Family Therapy through myself or Dr. Bone. Actually, we have 9 experts in PAS on the editorial board of this particular journal. The journal, you may recall, published the majority of Dr. Richard Gardner's articles. So it's been very much a lead journal in terms of parental alienation syndrome. Some of the names associated that are PAS experts around the country is Barry Brickland, who's located in Pennsylvania, Len Sperry, who wrote the foreword for the International Handbook on PAS, Amy Baker, whom you'll hear tonight, Dr. Michael Bone, who's also presenting here at the conference, Dr. Lorandis, who will be presenting on Sunday, Richard Warshak, who couldn't make it today or this weekend, but is very much a part of us being here today, David Levy from the Children's Rights Council, who will be presenting tomorrow, and Dr. Burnett and myself as well. So 9 PAS experts within one journal. It's quite unusual. And the appointment with Dr. Michael Bone is the special editor of themes. One of the themes that he specializes in is PAS. So we hope to publish many more articles and invite many of you that are writing articles to consider submitting to the American Journal of Family Therapy. There are 5 issues per year, and although there is a waiting list to get these things published, there is special consideration for PAS-related materials. And with that, I'd like to close and enjoy this evening and Dr. Baker's presentation. Thank you.